Making movies is a difficult thing. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of money at stake. Sometimes you have a hit on your hands and it sends you into the stratosphere, like Jaws did for Steven Spielberg or The Terminator did for James Cameron. This video is not about those movies. No, here I want to look at the movies that ended up nuking directors' careers. After the significant critical and commercial flops, many of these directors stepped away from directing entirely, either of their own accord or because they couldn't get another movie made. Kurt Wimmer started as a director, but mostly established himself as a screenwriter. He wrote movies like 1999's The Thomas Crown Affair, 2009's Law-Abiding Citizen, which is one of the best revenge movies ever made, and the remakes of Total Recall and Point Break. He directed 2002's Equilibrium, a sci-fi film starring Christian Bale and Taye Diggs with an interesting premise. It was set in a post-World War III world where feelings and artistic expression are disallowed, and citizens are forced to take drugs to suppress their emotions. Considering its eternally relevant themes, after failing at the box office and getting mixed reviews, it ended up becoming a cult hit. It's also got some fun action sequences that involved a lot of gun fu. It showed that Wimmer was capable of creating interesting, ambitious sci-fi worlds. It'd only be a few years before he tried his hand again at directing, this time with 2006's Ultraviolet. Like Equilibrium, this was an original sci-fi movie, something that we don't get nearly enough of, and it starred Mila Jovovich as a super soldier that derived her powers from a disease that gave the infected vampiric powers. Like Equilibrium, it's set in a dystopian world where things have gone to hell. Speaking of which, hell apparently describes the production on this movie. The movie was produced by Sony's Screen Gems division, which apparently did not like what Wimmer was doing. According to film critic Grant Watson, quote, Screen Gems, allegedly deeply unhappy with how Wimmer's film was shaping up, ripped it from the director's control, locked him out of the editing process entirely, and released their own truncated edit to cinemas, end quote. In doing so, Watson notes that they released it in an incomplete state. In fact, that's why some of the CGI looks rushed, terrible, and incomplete, because it was. On top of that, they trimmed its runtime from 117 minutes to 87 minutes. What might have been an ambitious, if flawed, sci-fi film became an incoherent mess with incomprehensible action, a nonsensical plot about a child with special blood, and visual effects that would have looked dated years earlier. Attempts at emotional depth were gutted, leaving only confusing action sequences strung together without logic or purpose. Philip Wunsch of the Dallas Morning News described it thusly, quote, ultra dumb, end quote. It pulled $31 million on a $30 million budget, a total bomb, though it did make bank in DVD sales. Both Wimmer and Jovovich reasonably have disowned the film. Wimmer says that his vision wasn't represented on screen, while Jovovich resented how they tore what could have been a decent movie into shreds. Alas, it all but stalled Wimmer's directing career. It would be 14 years before he directed another movie, 2020's Children of the Corn, whose release was impacted by the pandemic. Still, he seems to have a solid career writing screenplays. I hope he gets another directorial chance soon in the vein of his earlier stuff, which is thematically interesting. Speaking of Kurt Wimmer, he also wrote the screenplay for the aforementioned Total Recall remake. He didn't direct this one though. No, that was Len Wiseman. Wiseman had broken through as a director with 2003's Underworld, a fun vampire vs. werewolf action film that, despite reviews, pulled almost $96 million on a $22 million budget and kickstarted a franchise. He's a solid director who's able to deliver stylish action on a budget. He proved that out with Underworld Evolution and Live Free or Die Hard in 2007, which made $388 million on $110 million. 2012's Total Recall was his attempt to remake Paul Verhoeven's 1990 classic, and both were adapted from Philip K. Dick's We Can Remember It For You wholesale. The story and both movies deal with reality and memories. The protagonist, Douglas Squall, slowly learns just who he is throughout the story. The movie had a $125 million budget, and it starred Colin Farrell, Kate Beckinsale, and Jessica Biel. Wiseman tried to create a more grounded, less campy version of the story. However, the production suffered from fundamental creative decisions that doomed it from the start. One of the most glaring is that the setting was changed from Mars to a futuristic Earth. I imagine that this was Wimmer's doing, considering he seems to love future Earth settings. But in removing that, he also seemed to take out the outlandish elements of the story, such as the ending. The distinctive properties of the story and the campiness of Verhoeven's version were stripped out, leaving a generic action film. The film isn't without praiseworthy aspects. The world building, while uninspired, is competently done, as are the action sequences. but it lacked what makes Verhoeven's work so memorable: twisted humor, actual weirdness, and a satirical edge. Verhoeven's movies are still touted today because they stick with you. While I found it worth a one-time watch, 2012's Total Recall is not particularly memorable. It was, of course, compared to Verhoeven's version and found wanting. Rotten Tomatoes consensus reads, quote, "While it boasts some impressive action sequences, Total Recall lacks the intricate plotting, wry humor, and fleshed-out characters that made the original a sci-fi classic," end quote. At the box office, it cost more and made less than Verhoeven's version, despite being more than 20 years apart. The movie likely lost money. After, Wiseman completely disappeared as a film director for more than a decade doing some TV work. It wasn't until 2025 that he returned to the big screen with Ballerina, a spin-off of John Wick starring Ana de Armas. While a decent movie, it's uncertain who the credit should go to. While Wiseman ostensibly directed it, it's been reported that Chad Stahelski, director of the John Wick movies, oversaw significant reshoots. For now, Wiseman seems to be returning to TV to do an Underworld show, which I do look forward to. Jimmy Hayward came from the animation world, and he built a strong reputation working on Pixar films like Toy Story and Toy Story 2, Monsters Inc., and Finding Nemo. It's a little wonder then that he got a co-directing gig on 2008's Horton Hears a Who, along with Steve Martino. It's a charming, whimsical film that did well with critics and at the box office. He's obviously talented, but his background and the kinds of film that he had worked on made him an odd choice for his next directing gig. That was the ill-fated 2010 film Jonah Hex. This was Hayward's first live-action movie, and it paired him with Josh Brolin, Megan Fox, and Michael Fassbender working on a supernatural western based on the DC character. The production was troubled, to say the least, which makes sense when you consider how Hayward got the job. It wasn't a long selective process. While Hayward hasn't talked about the experience, Josh Brolin has. Brolin said that a Warner Brothers exec told him, quote, "Look, you've got to get a director in the next 2 weeks, otherwise we've got to can this thing." And then you meet somebody who has a lot of knowledge, Jimmy Hayward, and I remember it didn't feel right. I loved that he was excited, but he just didn't have the experience, and he didn't treat it like I would imagine somebody would want to treat it. To run back to their house at the end of every day and watch tonal inspirations and Scorsese movies or this or that. He would be out partying instead, end quote. This was also a whole new kind of movie for Hayward. It was like Andrew Stanton a couple of years later, another Pixar guy, who directed Finding Nemo and Wally, but then flopped big with 2012's John Carter. But Brolin doesn't think that it was Hayward's fault in particular. Hayward was a fan of the comics and he wanted to do right by the character. But as was the case for when David Fincher had Fox looking over his shoulder and annoying him on Alien 3 after hiring him to do a job, Warner Brothers did the same thing to Hayward here. When doing the interview rounds for Dune 2, Brolin said, quote, "I don't think it was Jimmy Hayward's fault. I think that's a misconception. He was a big Jonah Hex fan. We gave him a shot. He directed a pretty good movie, and then the studio took it and made it a much worse movie. I've seen that happen a couple of times. Once you get into pandering, into what you think the audience wants based on a cosmetic understanding, or at least a pretend understanding of what you think an audience wants, which nobody ever knows," end quote. What Hayward wanted was something darker and weirder, but what the studio wanted was something accessible and action-oriented. The result? A product that pleased no one. Not the studio, not the actors, not the fans. The cuts were so heavy, the entire movie is 81 minutes, or an hour 21 minutes long. Entire subplots were removed, and the narrative became nearly incoherent as a result. The visual effects looked cheap and poorly integrated, and the violence was cut to secure a PG-13 rating. It got dismal reviews and bombed at the box office. Hayward has only directed one movie since, 2013's Freebirds, which also got dismal reviews but did better at the box office than Jonah Hex. While Hayward might not have been the right man for the job, it's obvious that he didn't have the proper support or trust from the studio either. They seemingly set him up to fail, which is unfortunate. Joss Whedon was one of Hollywood's celebrated writer-directors. He got started in the late 90s and built a devoted fan base through his TV work on series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, and Firefly. He was able to parlay that into directing features, first with 2005's Serenity, but reaching his apex with his work on the Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron. The first Avengers became a cultural phenomenon, pulling more than $1.5 billion worldwide, getting critical acclaim, and setting a number of records. His writing became known for its quippy dialogue and banter, and he was able to deftly handle ensemble casts. It seemed reasonable, then, to bring him in to replace Zack Snyder on 2017's Justice League after the latter had to exit after family tragedy. Filming was complete and Whedon just had to oversee post-production, but then it was announced that Whedon would oversee 2 months of reshoots at a cost of $25 million. What should have been a simple finishing the job turned into a whole thing, with Whedon rewriting as much as 80 pages of the script. By the end, despite being credited to Zack Snyder, it was hardly Snyder's film. The reshoots dramatically altered the film's tone, something that's evident when you compare it against the later Snyder cut. Whether or not Whedon wanted to is another question. After the lackluster reception to Dawn of Justice, it seemed that Warner Brothers wanted a lighter, more Marvel-like film, which Whedon excelled at. The visual effects were rushed to meet the release date, and the final movie is a hodgepodge of visions. It made $661 million on a $300 million budget and got mixed reviews. But this is also the last movie that Joss Whedon has worked on. That might be because of reports that later emerged about workplace harassment. Ray Fisher, who played Cyborg, accused him of behavior that was, quote, gross, abusive, unprofessional, and completely unacceptable, end quote. That was then corroborated independently over time. First, Jason Momoa backed Fisher's sentiment. Then, WB investigated and said that they took action. Then, Gal Gadot told the LA Times that she, quote, had my own experience with them, which wasn't the best one, but I took care of it there and when it happened. I took it to the higher-ups and they took care of it, but I'm happy for Ray to go up and say his truth, end quote. But a little while later, she expanded on what Whedon did, saying that he threatened her career if she didn't record the lines that he wanted her to record. This was after Snyder had fostered a cooperative set, letting actors ad-lib and contribute to the film in their own capacity. It was a total 180. Then, Charisma Carpenter accused him of abusing his power while working on Buffy. Co-stars Amber Benson and Michelle Trachtenberg corroborated her accusations, and other co-stars supported her over Whedon. It was a hell of a fall from grace for a once-respected force in Hollywood, and one that seems entirely self-inflicted. After considering the number of accusations and corroborations, it appears it wasn't just smoke, but a full-blown fire. James Wong started as a successful writer, producer, and director, working on TV shows like 21 Jump Street and The X-Files, which he was able to turn into solid directing gigs. His first directorial feature was 2000's Final Destination, which made $113 million on a $23 million budget, and despite getting mixed reviews, kickstarted a franchise that's still going a quarter of a century later. While his next movie, The One, did not fare as well critically or commercially, Final Destination 3 recaptured the success of the first one. The guy could obviously work well with genre material and deliver on what audiences wanted from high-concept horror. It turned out that those skills did not transfer well to what is, so far, his last directorial outing. That's 2009's Dragonball Evolution, his attempt to bring Akira Toriyama's beloved manga and anime franchise to live action. As someone who grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, Toonami was my gateway to anime, and Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Mobile Suit Gundam, and Tenchi Muyo were chief among my favorites. Wong was not the first choice. Several directors passed on it reasonably, and when Fox sent him the script, he had to catch up on all things Dragon Ball. It ended up being a mismatch from the jump. Fox refused to put in the money or effort required to make it a good movie, and the result was a generic teen action movie that bore zero resemblance to the spirit or aesthetic of the manga or anime because its director didn't know anything about it. Characters were reimagined or omitted, the mythology was simplified, and Goku, played by Justin Chatwin, became a teenager having trouble fitting in at high school. Reviews were predictably atrocious. Glenn Whipp, writing for the LA Times, noted that, quote, director James Wong and writer Ben Ramsey are utterly blasé in their approach to the series' mythology and structure, cobbling together an 84-minute movie that seems to exist only to rile up fanboys. On that account, and that account alone, Dragon Ball Evolution triumphs, end quote. James Marsters, who played Piccolo, said that the studio lied to him. In his words, quote, they told me it was a $120 million picture and that Stephen Chow was producing, and I get out to Durango, Mexico, and it's a $30 million picture and Stephen Chow is just on paper to fool us down into the desert, end quote. Writer Ben Ramsey, meanwhile, was contrite, saying, quote, I went into the project chasing after a big payday, not as a fan of the franchise, but as a businessman taking on an assignment. I have learned that when you go into a creative endeavor without passion, you come out with suboptimal results, and sometimes flat-out garbage. So, I'm not blaming anyone for Dragon Ball but myself. As a fanboy of other series, I know what it's like to have something you love and anticipate be so disappointing, end quote. Justin Chatwin apologized for the adaptation in a tribute to Akira Toriyama after his passing in 2024. Akira Toriyama figured that the film would flop. He called it bland and said it didn't capture his intentions with the series. He had offered notes to the studio of how to improve it, but was ignored. In the end, the movie was a critical and commercial failure. After the flop, Wong returned to TV. Wally Pfister started off as a cinematographer. He started in the 90s, but became well known for his work with Christopher Nolan, with whom he worked on 7 movies, one of them being Inception, which won him an Academy Award for Best Cinematography. Pfister and Nolan both liked working with film over digital, and his technical mastery and artistic eye made him respected among his peers. His transition to directing then seemed natural. Alas, Pfister would become a one-and-done kind of director. This one is pretty simple compared to the others. I can explain it in 2 words: big flop. As opposed to the other directors on this list who directed more than one movie, Pfister got one shot and that was it. The movie was 2014's Transcendence, which starred Johnny Depp. Pfister was afforded a massive budget, which ran as high as $150 million, a mind-boggling sum for a first-time director. The film touched on themes of artificial intelligence, transhumanism, and opposition to technological progress by an anti-tech group called Rift, or Revolutionary Independence from Technology. That is to say, it touched on themes that are eternally relevant, more so now than ever before. But just because a theme might be relevant doesn't mean that the execution is good. Visually, the movie looks great, but it failed to tackle its subject matter adequately. Philosophical questions were raised and then never explored. The emotional stakes never landed, and the film seemed more interested in seeming smart than being smart. That is, it looked great on the outside, but was hollow on the inside. The movie made just $103 million at the box office, a total disaster, and was thrashed by critics who called it pretentious, silly, a slog, amateurish, and more. The fact that it crested $100 million at the box office suggests that there was something interesting here, but word of mouth derailed it. It also seemingly derailed Pfister's big screen ambitions. He's done some TV and commercial work in the meanwhile, but nothing on the big screen, which is a shame. He's obviously great when it comes to the look of a movie. I hope he gets another shot soon, but maybe with a better writer. Sergey Bodrov is an interesting case. He's a solid director. Insofar as I can tell, he's the only one that's been able to make a halfway decent movie about Genghis Khan. To be sure, it's impossible to tell Khan's story in a movie. You'd need a show for that. But considering that the competition is John Wayne's The Conqueror, Bodrov's 2007 epic Mongol wins by default. It's aided by the fact that it is on its own a decent movie, an epic in the vein of David Lean's films, which is probably some of the highest praise that you can give to a movie. Beyond its epic nature, the movie had emotional depth, and while there were inaccuracies, Bodrov paid as much attention to detail as he could. Moreover, he proved that he could handle large productions. With 2015's Seventh Son, Bodrov got to work on his biggest movie yet, a would-be blockbuster that had a budget of as high as $110 million. It was based on 2004's The Spook's Apprentice, and was about a seventh son of a seventh son who has to learn how to fight witches and stop a cadre of them from wreaking havoc. If this sounds like a generic, dark fantasy action-adventure film, that's because it was. It was expensive but soulless, a far cry from Mongol, though in this case it seems that Bodrov was mostly brought on as a director for hire, as the man to execute the job. To be sure, you can see the money on screen to an extent, but in focusing all their efforts on gloss and none of it on story, they came up with a shell of a movie that's worth a one-time watch but forgettable afterwards. It was a waste of talent and resources. The LA Times' Betsy Sharkey put it well, quote, "For acclaimed Russian director Bodrov, this foray into English language filmmaking is a rare film. Bodrov certainly knows his way around epics, as his excellent Oscar-nominated films, Mongol and Prisoner of the Mountains, attest. Seventh comes as a shock. Virtually every performance falls flat, aided no doubt by the vapid dialogue, and Bridges is saddled with an awful accent he never masters," end quote. The movie made $114 million on its massive budget, an unqualified disaster. Bodrov's made just one movie since, 2022's Breathe Easy. What he does next is unknown. I know he wanted Mongo to be the first of a trilogy, so perhaps that might be the way to go. One can only hope. Jean de Bont is one of my favorite 90s directors despite having just 2 great movies. He started as a cinematographer, a time when he was scalped by a lion while working on Roar, and worked on films like Ridley Scott's Black Rain, John McTiernan's Die Hard, and Paul Verhoeven's Basic Instinct. After that, he moved into directing and made a tremendous splash with 1994's Speed, one of the best action films ever made. It was a critical and commercial hit, and he followed that with 1996's Twister, a disaster classic and the second highest grossing film of that year. For a moment, it seemed as though he had the golden touch when it came to high concept action movies, knowing how to deliver spectacular set pieces with real impact. Things quickly took a turn for the worse though. It's hard to say which of the next 3 movies actually nuked his career, but a strong case can be made for 2 of them. First, there was Speed 2, Cruise Control, where instead of a bus, it's a boat, and instead of Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, it's only Sandra Bullock. Reeves wisely decided not to return after reading the script. It's considered to be the worst sequel of all time and one of the worst movies of all time to boot, and lost as much as $70 million for the studio. Then there's 1999's The Haunting. It's a horror film, a different kind of movie for Bont, and while it did okay at the box office, reviews were atrocious. But it could also be the final feature film that Bont directed. That was 2003's Lara Croft Tomb Raider, The Cradle of Life. Starring Angelina Jolie, it was a sequel to the 2001 film directed by Simon West. The first one did alright at the box office, and everyone thought that they could eke out another win. That did not happen. The movie had a troubled production, and Bont tested the experience. In his words, quote, "It was not such a great experience, but more from the reason how the studio tried to really interfere with it in a way. And the thing itself is that the makers of the game were also involved, and they never told me that they also have a say in the story. Suddenly there were all these changes that have been taken, and who had to be what and what cast, and then suddenly it became a big scene. Everything was a big deal," unquote. You get the sense that this is a movie made by committee, and it shows. It was a generic action film, competently made, worth perhaps a one-time watch. But none of his movies post-Twister really had that thrill to them, and that was the case here. The movie performed okay at the box office and got negative reviews. Bont wants to do another movie. From a Variety interview, he said, quote, "There's still some ideas that I have that make for a really exciting movie. I mean, one more would be good," unquote. I just hope that he gets it. Many of these directors are, on the whole, competent at their jobs. Alas, events transpired in such a way that they laid them low. Sometimes it was entirely self-inflicted, other times it was studio interference. Whether or not any of them will return to prominence is uncertain, though in some cases it does seem unlikely.